Hi everyone, welcome to this really, I think it's going to be a fantastic event to celebrate, of course, Winnie M Li's new book, but also to have a real discussion about some of the issues that affect each and every one of us. And I think everyone on this platform here have reflected so brilliantly and eloquently on these issues. So I think we're in for a real treat, at least I'm looking forward to this event. So welcome. This is an event that's been organized by the SHAME Project, which is a Wellcome Trust-funded interdisciplinary project looking at medical and psychiatric aspects of sexual violence here at Birkbeck, and also by Clear Lines, which runs the first ever festival which explores questions of sexual violence through the arts and public engagement. So really thanks for both to the SHAME Project and of course to Clear Lines. A few sort of housekeeping issues to get through, I'm afraid. The first thing is that we're not expecting any test of fire alarm systems. So if an alarm does go off, it is a real alarm. So please make your ways to either the back door or this one here. Toilets, the men's toilets are on the floor where the reception hall is, and the ladies' one are on the ground floor, so up another set of stairs. Note that this event is being live streamed and recorded, but the only people who will be recorded are the speakers up here on the platform. There's a lot of people who are at this event online, so welcome to all the online people. We're really pleased you could make it. I know a lot of you wanted to be here in person, but a combination of COVID and of course train strikes and chaos more generally means you can't. But if you are there online, please put comments or questions in the chat. We will come back to them at the quick Q&A at the end of the evening. And if we don't have time to get through all of those questions or comments, we will get back to them in the next few days. Both for people here in person and for those online, we can buy copies of this book upstairs. If you're here in person, you can get it signed by the author. But if you are online, you can actually get signed copies through the bookseller. So please make use of this opportunity. Everyone here knows that this event is going to refer to sexual violence. And by its nature, this can be distressing. You would all have received, when you signed up, a safeguarding statement. And for those of you here in person, you've got one in front of you. Those of you online, you will also have received, you'll see it in the chat. So please, if you do feel upset or just want to have a break for a minute, just feel free just to leave and come back if and when you want to. Final housekeeping. It goes on forever, housekeeping, doesn't it? I'm so sorry. Final housekeeping, though, is that we will be live tweeting this event. So if you're on Twitter, please feel free to share your thoughts and hashtag at SHAME without an A, so SHME _ then BBK, that's for Birkbeck, and use the hashtag Complicit. So that is the end of the housekeeping. So once again, welcome to everyone here. I'm just now going to just do a few sentences, literally introducing the people on the panel before we start our discussion. First person I want to introduce is Rowena Chiu, who I'm my first time meeting her, so I'm a bit of a fan, so excuse me if I start hyperventilating here. It's a real honor to actually meet you in person. Rowena Chiu worked as an assistant to Harvey Weinstein in 1998. After leaving the film industry, no surprise there, I think, for most of us here, she's worked in the fields of management consulting and international development. She holds an MA in English Language and Literature from the University of Oxford, MSc in International Management for China, University of London, and an MBA from the London Business School. But currently, I believe she's working on a memoir and a screenplay about her experiences in the film industry. So really looking forward to that in the future. And if you want to launch, just think of us. That would be great. The second person I want to introduce is going to come up here on the screen. Let me not introduce her second then. Liz Kelly is the next person I want to introduce. And Liz was actually responsible, she doesn't know this by the way, responsible for me working on sexual violence, because it's her inspiring work from the 1980s that just, I mean, blew me and the people I knew away. So really pleased that she can come and speak to us today. She's Professor of Sexualized Violence at the London Metropolitan University, Director of the Child and Women Abuse Studies Unit, holds the Roddick Chair on Violence Against Women, and has been active in this field for 4 decades. I mean, she's the author of so many things, many things, but I guess the most, the one that made a huge impact on me particularly was a book called Surviving Sexual Violence, which established this idea of a continuum of violence. So a very powerful voice in these circles. Katherine Angel, at the end there, author of an internationally acclaimed book called Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again, which is a great read. And if you want to see her talking about her book, there's a really great interview in London Review of Books online, which I really recommend. But we're going to hear from her in person. Also, authors of course, many other books, Daddy and Unmastered, a book on desire, Most Difficult to Tell. Her work has been translated into 9 languages, and she teaches creative and critical writing here at Birkbeck. Marai, I'm not sure if you can hear me now. Pleased to see you again. Okay, she can, great. She is a Black African Caribbean British feminist and advocate, community organizer and consultant who has worked in social justice for over 25 years with particular focus on ending violence against Black and global majority women and girls. Until May 2019, she was the executive director of IMCAN, and she also served as the co-chair of the End Violence Against Women Coalition. And today she is the professor of practice, not today, literally, recently, she's our professor of practice in the Department of Sociology at Durham University. So really pleased you can join us online, Winnie. Really pleased to see you. So that's over. Let's now really get started. Winnie.
Hi.
Hi. Winnie, of course, this is the person we are celebrating today is the author and activist, writer in residence at Birkbeck, Harvard graduate, early career in the film industry, career disrupted when she was raped by a violent stranger in Belfast, 2008, and that was the theme, or became the theme, of her first novel, prize-winning novel, called Dark Chapter, which has been translated, I believe, into 10 languages. Yeah, which is amazing. Tell me how you do it, please.
I don't do the translation.
She is also the co-founder, I should say, of Clear Lines. And if that's not enough, she also is doing a PhD on media engagement of rape survivors. Is that right?
Yeah, how rape survivors are engaging with the media as a form of activism.
Good.
But I am doing a PhD very slowly. Very slowly.
Most of us do it very slowly. Yeah.
I'm even slower. So.
But of course, what we're here to talk about today is her second novel, which is Complicit. It's a great read. I really enjoyed it. So look, Winnie, tell us, I guess the obvious 2 questions I wanted to ask was, how did you come to write this novel, and how does it relate to your first novel?
Yeah, I mean, I guess So it's two questions I can kind of answer in one go. I mean, it's very obvious. So my first novel, Dark Chapter, was a fictional reimagining of my real life rape. And as Joanna said, my rapist was he was a complete stranger who followed me in the park. And he was a 15-year-old boy. So there were, so that kind of fell into your classic myth of the stranger rape, right? Which is the way, when we envision rape, the way the media tends to portray it, the way the popular imagination about rape goes, it is that stranger attacking you, even though in reality we know 9 out of 10 victims are actually assaulted by someone they know. So that was Dark Chapter, and you know, to kind of really, I suppose, get across the impact that rape and sexual assault has in your life. I mean, I was working as a film producer, or a fledgling wannabe film producer for a production company up until 2008 when the rape happened. And that effectively ended my career. And it took years to recover, and then part of the recovery, I started thinking, okay, I've always wanted to write, so maybe I want to write a book that explores my rape, but see usually from the viewpoint of the victim and the perpetrator, which became Dark Chapter. So kind of along the way, after I'd kind of sufficiently recovered, 5.5 years later, I started writing that. So that came out in 2017. And then the Weinstein allegations broke, or they went public in autumn of 2017. So it kind of was in some ways good for Dark Chapter, because suddenly everyone was talking about sexual assault, and it was very much in the public conversation, which it still is now. So for me, I was kind of like, okay, this is interesting that all these people are talking about rape and sexual assault in a context where I'm kind of familiar, which is the film industry. So my agent at the time had recommended, well, you know, what are you thinking of writing next for your book? I'm like, oh, I don't really know. And they'd said, I mean, well, you are quite well placed to write about all the stuff that's happening, right? Because you used to work in the film industry, and you yourself were a survivor of sexual assault. So I was kind of like, yeah, I don't want to write about rape again, right? You know, I mean, I've done that, and like, you know, the promotion and the constant conversation about that topic can get emotionally draining, and that sort of issue of emotional labor for activists is something I do want to talk quite a lot about. So I was like, okay, how can I write about this in a way that's interesting to me, right? So I was like, well, let's make it about the film industry, and let's kind of have a classic story of a young person, a young woman in this instance, who wants to become a filmmaker or who wants to work in film, and she's working her way up, and then along the way she encounters this issue because of the way that the industry is structured, because of the patriarchy, because of, you know, all the different, the exclusivity of the film industry. And so let's have it about that. So for me, that was the way to make it interesting, was that, yeah, obviously it's about #MeToo, that all the marketing talks about that, and so obviously it will address sexual assault, but for me it's really about that industry and that world that makes it so difficult for young women to kind of have the careers they would like to have. And then also as a way for me to channel my sense of loss about no longer working in film, and also try to celebrate the movies, because, you know, I love the movies still, right? So how do I write about movies in a way that's fun, that kind of captures the glamour, the supposed glamour of the industry, but also captures the reality of the kinds of inequalities in that workplace and in that industry?
I mean, I know I talk to a lot of people who, like you, have written about their own personal experience, or they are writing about sexual violence, and that's not their direct personal experience. And what they come back to time and again is that emotional labor that goes into it, which is different to when you're writing about a subject that maybe doesn't impinge directly on your life or the life of your loved ones and or your friends and family, because, you know, all of us, you know someone who's had this happen to them. When we're writing about it, it's a very different experience. So I know there are people here in this room who are also writing about this topic. How do you deal with those issues?
Yeah, I don't have any hard and fast rules. And I think for me, I mean, Dark Chapter was in some ways the harder book to write, because that was more directly about my experience. And it is kind of, it's quite hard-hitting. I don't, you know, don't pull any punches in terms of the way I represent sexual violence and the impact on the victim, or the roots of sexual violence, perhaps. So for me, Complicit was more fun to write, because it was about the industry, and I was kind of reliving this world that I used to work in. But I guess, you know, self-care is important for any activist, but then also for writers who are engaging with their own trauma as a subject matter. You know, I guess general rules would be limit the amount of time, you know, or kind of break down the work into like bite-sized chunks and make sure that you're filling the well, so to speak, as they often say, in kind of writing speak the artist's way. Like, you need to be equally inspired by the outside world, because the act of creation, particularly around the subject matter, can be quite exhausting. And there's nothing wrong with taking breaks, and there's nothing wrong, and obviously just experiment with writing, because, I mean, it's one thing you can write. I guess I could have written a straightforward, like, memoir, but for me that wouldn't have been interesting, so I had to find a sort of creative joy out of in the writing of it, otherwise I just would have been depressed, right, because it is depressing subject matter, so I guess for me the challenge was, how do I take quite depressing and heavy subject matter and make it entertaining and make it still kind of intriguing for people to read.
And one of the ways you do that is by this really, the central character, the central female character is such an intriguing, complex person. Can you tell us, for those of us who haven't read the novel, how did you come to that character?
So Marai Larasi is the main character, and she is, I guess, a version of me, I suppose, right? Who maybe had slightly different circumstances. So, I mean, Sarah's 39 when the novel opens. The novel opens in autumn of 2017. The Weinstein allegations are breaking, and she's contacted by a New York Times journalist, a quite celebrated young male New York Times journalist, who says, like, I've got a few questions about this male producer you used to work with. And Sarah no longer works in the industry. It's 10 years since she left the industry, and she's kind of teaching screenwriting at kind of a no-name college. And so she has a huge sense of loss about that industry, that career she never had in film producing. So she's quite bitter about that in some ways. And then she's also starting to see all these, the Weinstein allegations happening. And obviously she herself has her own story. So initially the question is she going to speak to this journalist, and what is she going to reveal to him? And how much is she going to reveal? And so for me, I wanted to channel sort of my own experiences in film, but then also ask myself, like, well, what would I have done if I had had a male boss like that in the industry? And I was quite lucky. I had a female boss who was great and very supportive, and there is a female boss in the book as well, but then sort of a guy shows up with a lot of money who's going to finance the production company, so suddenly he kind of takes over. So I wanted to kind of channel how ambitious I was at that time and how much I really, really wanted to be producing films, and to have that sort of cruelly ended through circumstances that are outside my control. I guess I kind of wanted to look at that situation. And it's good that Sarah's complex, because people are complex in real life, and she is put in difficult situations and makes choices sometimes which aren't great choices, but I guess I was trying to explore how somebody might make those kinds of choices because of the situation that you're in, and how in some ways, if you're working in a really male-dominated industry, if you have such few opportunities, the few opportunities you do have, how are you going to choose to act in those instances?
Yeah, both you and Rowena work on topics, or write on topics that are really at the heart of news today. Tell us about that experience, doing something that is, it's center of news.
Yeah, I mean, on one level, on a cynical level, you're like, okay, this is like, people are thinking about this topic, so it's going to connect with readers, hopefully, right? But then also, for me, as an author, I don't want to write something that like 5 people are going to read. Ideally, I want the amount of work that goes into making a book. I want to actually write something that will reach a large audience. So on one hand, yeah, you're writing something which is timely, according to a lot of the different reviews, and yes, it is timely. But on the other hand, it's timely because it connects with things that a lot of people have experienced in their day-to-day lives. But I suppose the danger is, everyone knows what #MeToo is about, roughly, right? So there sort of isn't a surprise that that's in the novel. So for me, the challenge was, how do I write it in a way which still builds suspense and leads the reader to think, okay, is Sarah going to be complicit in hiding abuse, or is she going to be a victim, or she may be both in some ways? Yeah.
And Rowena, about, your experiences. Let's bring you in here.
Okay, so obviously everybody knows kind of Rowena's experience. I guess for me, I had been writing I've been writing Complicit for a while when your story finally went public. So I had written about 3 drafts, and I was heavily pregnant when suddenly I saw this New York Times opinion piece flash up, and the headline is "Harvey Weinstein said he liked Chinese girls," and I was like, wow, okay, so there actually is a Chinese woman out there, a Chinese diaspora woman out there who has worked with Harvey Weinstein. So on one hand, I was like, oh my god, like what if her experience is exactly like what I've written about? And on the other hand, I was quite nervous to be like, oh, this woman actually might read my book. And then through different circumstances, it turns out we know people in common. So then you actually reached out to me. So I guess my question to you is like, first of all, what was your whole experience of this entire story breaking in some ways? But then what was your experience of like, why did you decide to reach out to me? And ultimately, you know, what has your experience been like since? And I guess, what do you think about my book that I'm quite nervous about?
Oh, be careful now, be careful.
Did you see? She was very reluctant to give me the mic. So I think it's interesting that the word timely, of course, is on the front cover of this book, because the word timely applies to this, our multiple stories in funny different ways, because the Weinstein saga, of course, was breaking in 2017 when this book was at the inception of this book. But I myself took 2 years to decide to speak out about my story. And I think in terms of reading Winnie's book recently, it really brought me back to that time period between 2017 and 2019, which is a very weird time of my life, because in some ways my story and what had happened to me was finally out in the open, but my name was still anonymous. And so I spent 2 years, somebody once characterized it as a 20-year silence and 2 years of privacy, and then subsequent time of being public. So I see that my story comes in sort of these 3 chapters, so to speak, obviously one chapter being much longer than the others. I won't hold Winnie in suspense any longer. I do have some comments to make about the book. And as a preamble to making any comments about the book at all, I think you should all know that we haven't actually had time to talk about it at all. So she's in the very unfortunate situation of I'm about to give her essentially what is a review on her book live in front of all of you.
I think this is the definition of power.
It could be. What I wanted to say is, of course, the book is absolutely all the things that these wonderful reviews say about it. It is gripping and compulsive and incredibly powerful. I think for me, it was really the bizarrest experience reading it in really a tsunami of very bizarre experiences that have happened to me since my story went public. It's impossible for me not to relate very closely to Sarah Lai. A lot of the events in the book are close to certainly to things that have happened to me. So to pull a couple of moments out of the book, you know, that moment when Tom Gallagher emails her and she's like in utter shock and wondering whether or not to go public and thinking about what the possible consequences were. It's hard not to go back to the fall of 2017 when I say we, both my husband and I and anyone that ever worked with me and my HR department were getting pretty hotly pursued by either Jodie Cantor or Megan Tui or Rowena Farrow and a number of other journalists that were attempting to contact us. So there were emails coming into our inboxes, there were journalists, everything from emails coming into my inboxes, my HR department being called, to Jodie eventually turning up on the doorstep of my house. So I want to make some comments about being a sexual assault victim and reading about things that have been written about sexual assault, because of course we've touched on that topic already, and that will be of interest to this panel and hopefully many of you. I am always surprised about how triggering it is to read things that do match my experience. And so when I say the experience of reading the book was very bizarre, one of the brilliant, and I must say brilliant things about the book is the level of visceral reaction I had to it. It is almost impossible for me to read the book as though it's a work of fiction. When Sarah's sitting in a cafe with Tom, I'm thinking about the time I'm sitting in a Brooklyn studio with Rowena Farrow. I can't help but refer back to that. There are many moments through the novel where she's asked, as Winnie has already said, to make very difficult decisions upon which her career and her whole life, really as she knows it, could pivot, whether or not you make this decision or that decision. And I think there was a moment really where I had to put the book down, where she's in a room and she is really cajoled into taking drugs off a naked woman. I will say, for the record, that I've never taken drugs off a naked woman, just in case there's any doubt. But, of course, in working for Harvey, and not just in working for Harvey, but in the years I spent in the film industry in general, you're always asked to push the needle just a little bit further in terms of ethical compromise. And that really, I think what is fascinating about this book is it lifts the lid on not just is a loaded word, but not only sexual assault within the film industry, which is in itself is a huge, huge topic, but what happens in the film industry around an atmosphere where sexual assault is not only tolerated, but almost encouraged as sort of boys' play or locker room, whatever, or hey, this is an industry where it's all sex, drugs, rock and roll, so go for it. So there's a sort of atmosphere of cajolement and entitlement, and it's almost like all bets are off. You can do what you like. This is the Wild West. We don't have, and there's pride in we don't have HR departments. We don't have laws, and in fact, we can work around that. And there was a real belief that, a bit like student hazing, there was a lot of belief in the film industry that they were above the law and above, that money would buy whatever you wanted and you could do whatever you wanted. And so in order to survive as a young assistant who was ambitious, just like Sarah Lai and just like Winnie was when she worked in the film industry, you had to decide for yourself where your own personal lines were, and it was often incredibly hard to stick to those lines. And they would be ethical lines, moral lines, financial lines, physical lines. Lots of different lines were blurred for you. And I have subsequently, since leaving film, in a cloud of dispute and threat from Weinstein himself, I've worked in a number of other industries, and I will say that nothing is like the sort of atmosphere and difficulty of maintaining lines in an industry that really is so much like the Wild West. So consequently, I think it's an incredibly important book because I have had direct experience of attempting to explain this atmosphere of cajolement and entitlement. And I think that nobody really gets this unless you are directly in the film industry and have this level of experience. And I am grateful to both Winnie and her novel Complicit for lifting the lid, doing their part in lifting the lid on this, but also that the Me Too movement has brought this kind of conversation into the public arena, that a light has been shone on abuses in the film industry that go way beyond sexual abuses, financial abuses, abuse of assistants in general, both male and female, young and old. And I hope that in this dawn of a new era that Me Too has ushered in, that this will really make actual systematic change in the film industry.
I'm going to bring Marai in just a couple of minutes, but before I do, to what extent do you think that, and I'm going to ask a similar question to you, Marai, in just 1 minute. To what extent do you think, Rowena, that it is going to, that the Me Too movement, that the prosecution of Weinstein is going to make a difference?
Well, obviously I get asked this question a great deal, and I think I got asked this question much more in the early days, at least immediately after I broke my story in 2019, when the Me Too movement was still relatively young. I was 2 years old at that time. The burning question was really what it will be the long-term impact of Me Too. And of course now we are speaking about Me Too in a kind of post-COVID era where for a while it was very much in the headlines, and then a bigger story around COVID-19 came and sort of swept, if you like, the Me Too movement off immediate headlines. But in some ways that's a much more interesting time because that gives space and quiet for the real work of the Me Too movement to take place. And I think what I want to do is answer that question in the context of this book, actually. In the initial stages of the Me Too movement, certainly in 2017, it was about the big name A-list Hollywood actresses. It was about Gwyneth Paltrow and Ashley Judd and the shock of household names speaking out against another household name, Harvey Weinstein. And it was originally viewed as, ugly Hollywood producer preying on beautiful blonde actresses. But of course, the Me Too movement very quickly moved away from that, as many actresses came out against Harvey, but then increasingly that wave of actresses gave way to a wave of assistants and employees and people who didn't have a household name but still had a harrowing story to tell. And what I think is, whenever I get asked that question, I think about how, as shocking as Harvey himself has been, in terms of the number of women that he's assaulted, but also the things that have been done to those women. And it's very important that a light was shone on all that for all of his innumerable victims and survivors. But beyond that, it's important that the Me Too movement moves on from just being about Harvey, or just being about Bill Cosby, or just being about Matt Lauer, or any number of the famous men that fell at the beginning of the Me Too movement, and moves into an era of being relevant also to the ordinary Joe on the street, or the man on the Clapham omnibus, as I like to say in an English context. I always spoke about how, in some ways, the big name predators in the early days of the Me Too industry were at risk of being over-monsterized, in the sense that if you hinge terrible behaviour on these big name folks that did terrible, terrible things, the risk is your ordinary person who leans a bit close to a young assistant, or puts a hand on the bottom of a colleague, or engages in a bit of locker room talk, sees themselves as harmless. And it was always our mission, if you like, as the movement has moved on, to say, actually, it's a movement that's relevant across women, and not just women, but survivors of sexual assault of both genders, anyone that's in a position of lesser power, across the age spectrum, across the gender spectrum, across the power spectrum. And I think it's really important, and that's partly what this book does. It says a predator, even one as powerful as Hugo North or Harvey Weinstein, cannot operate in a vacuum. There's a whole environment of enablers that exist, supporting that person, covering up their misdeeds, even encouraging them to go ahead, because this is their right and privilege to go ahead and take what they want because they're in a position of power.
Yeah, lovely. And this is what Complicit does so brilliantly. It just exposes that. Marai, thank you for joining us on the screen there. I mean, it's a similar question, I guess, to you, because, I mean, you are the rock star of British feminism. So I'm just interested in your views when you were reading Complicit.
First of all, just to say, I'm really sorry I couldn't be there in person. So I'm in a hotel room and there's a wedding outside, so there might be drums at any minute. Winnie, I want to thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. And it feels weird saying congratulations for a book that is focused on such painful issues, but I also want to say congratulations before I kind of respond to what Joe just asked. Okay, so I think one of the things that Winnie does so beautifully with this novel is to show complexity. And I'm really grateful for the specific ways that, say, the celebrity space, the media space, the entertainment space, the Hollywood type space, I'm really grateful for the way that there's that focusing in, but it's all very recognizable and relatable, right? So although this is one industry and everything is scaled up, there's so many elements of, if you like, the story that I think so many survivors, so many human beings, so many people who have questioned their own position, their own kind of quote unquote failure to act, or whatever the thing is that has happened for them, will actually see in Sarah's story, we'll see Sarah's reflection. I think there's something also for me that was really skillful, and Winnie, I promise not just bigging you up. I really did like note this and go, okay, so this is right? So I'm actually gonna have to read it because I also was doing this with it, and like I really just want to just read it without thinking about tonight. But the way that you highlight the casual sexism, the casual racism, the exploitation, the way those intersect, as Rowena already spoke about, like Liz Kelly calls it the conducive context, you know, that dynamic backdrop of patriarchy, that drip, you know, effect where actually this coercion is playing out like all the time, and how someone who, because it's also not a conversation like about morality in this tidy way, right? Like, and I think that for me was really powerful because it also speaks to the messiness of what we have to grapple with in terms of sexual violence, in terms of heteropatriarchy, etc. I also really appreciate that there wasn't this thing of a single survivor voice. There wasn't this homogenizing of survivors. And actually even having one character, and I don't want to give the story away for folks who haven't read it, even having one character having to be told, but you also were abused, right? Like that moment where for her, she hadn't been seeing herself in that way. Like for me, like just those nuances in the novel were so important and so beautifully done. We also get to engage with the role that responsible journalism can play, and I think that also speaks to something around the space to speak out and to challenge and to also move beyond this idea of individual bad apples, so that we can hold like the layers of perpetration and complicity in ways that a lot of our training and thinking hasn't encouraged us to think about. Also, just a little thing about, I love really the ways that you have like dotted in these moments of resistance, and that kind of those moments of resistance that really give way to like an activist heart. So, Joe, I don't know if that completely answered the question, and I don't even know if folk can hear me properly. So.
Yeah, we can hear you. I mean, I also like those moments of resistance. And I think when I was listening to you speak just then, I was thinking about your views. I mean, you've been working in this field for a very long time. And what your views are about the role of fiction in this fight, in the resistance to sexual violence.
Yes.
So I'd just like to hear more from you about that.
Yeah, so for me, I think like we need all of it. Fiction is one space. Like we need art, we need material that allows complicated stories to be told. One of the things I was chatting with Liz on the weekend, and I was saying one of the things when I was early on in my practice, I remember hearing Liz speak about the messiness of work around sexual violence, the messiness of the space of sexual violence sometimes, and the fact that actually it's almost as human beings, we try to resist some of the complexity of the space. And actually the thing that this book does is it actually goes, hello, this is untidy, right? Like it's incredibly simple in terms of this is power over and this is violence. Yeah, totally. But the complexity of human behavior within that is not always, that you don't always have the space in some of the work to explore that. And art, like creativity, fiction, like gives so much space for those layers and connections and the messiness of this to actually be skillfully narrated. So like for me, fiction is 100% important, like other kind of creative spaces.
Yeah, look, thanks. I mean, Liz Kelly, because this brings in your work here, because so much of your work, Liz, is domestic violence. And I was just wondering, if, as you were reading this novel, what kind of relationship were you seeing between the sorts of violence that you work on, which a lot of it is domestic, and this workplace violence?
Firstly, Winnie, I want to say thank you. And I want to say that I love that you said that Sarah's a version of you, because I sat reading this and thinking about you. And not that I know you, I don't know you really well, but I know you enough to have seen glimpses of you. And I wondered whether I was misreading anyway. Actually, Joe, I've worked on sexual violence always. Sometimes we get more money to work on domestic violence because there's more money there, but I have never not worked on sexual violence. And at the moment, I'm reading police files every day of rape cases, and they're not pleasant. They're not pleasant because of what happens to people, but they're also really unpleasant in the ineptitude of the police to do anything useful. So I haven't done that much about workplaces, but I have worked with Perna Sen when she was at UN Women and I can't remember what her stupid long name was, but anyway, she was asked to sort out sexual harassment in the UN. And when she tried to really do that, they said, I think we've had enough of you, goodbye. And some of you can see her talking about that on a documentary that was broadcast last night on BBC called The Whistleblowers, about how rife sexual harassment is in the UN and how there, despite the General Secretary saying there is zero tolerance, it is still totally tolerated and there are no consequences for even people who have multiple complainees. So now the UN isn't an ordinary workplace, and nor is Hollywood. But I think one of the things that they, if you think about them, they tell us is that there are particular lines of power, to use the word of Dorothy Smith, Canadian sociologist who died last week. You need to look at the lines of power in organisations, and organisations where there are very extreme hierarchies, whether it's wealth or that you're the CEO of a really big company or whatever, those people have much more license. Where the power relations are less, I think we might find that there's less abuse. Not none, but I think we might find that there's less, and less of particular kinds of abuse, because it's you're not using existing power and then reinforcing it through other things, whether it's gifts or drugs or whatever thing abusers choose to use to make people complicit in their behaviour, not necessarily complicit in their sexual abuse, but they're complicit in the license they give themselves. So I think this is something really important about understanding workplaces as having lines of power and looking at those lines of power and thinking, how are they being used and abused?
Yeah, I mean, and doesn't that also suggest ways forward in terms of eradicating sexual violence in workplaces more generally?
I think it suggests that if we didn't have society, workplaces, families everywhere, which weren't based on power relations, we might have a chance of getting rid of sexual violence. But and I do think we need that kind of revolution. I don't feel we're quite close to it, and so we're trying to find ways to find actions or ways of doing things differently that take us along that road. I think that's the only choice we have, to find things that take you closer to that, and thinking about critically about power and also taking responsibility if you are someone who has. I have the power of my status. I have to think really carefully about, do I ever use it, and what is an ethical use of it? So an ethical use of it for me is to use it if I'm writing an expert opinion for an asylum seeker who I've done an expert opinion about sexual violence. I will use everything there, but I don't use it for me to enable me to have even more than I already have. What I've got is sometimes feels too much compared to many of the women I spend my time with. So I think there are ways of thinking and working with power critically ourselves.
That's just a wonderful statement. Thank you. Thanks very much. Katherine, tomorrow sex will be good again. I'm really curious about your thoughts on Complicit, because you've written so eloquently, you've spoken so eloquently about issues of female representation of women, on consent. Just tell us how you read this novel in relationship to your own passions.
Sure. Is this working? Yes. I mean, I found reading Complicit really powerful, and I'm finding sitting here listening to everyone speak very, very powerful as well. And I suppose one of the things before I talk maybe about the novel specifically is this question that I think is being raised about speech, about the act of speaking about these kinds of experiences. Because one of the things that really preoccupied me in the kind of unfolding Me Too moment was the way in which people were kind of literally putting microphones in front of women's faces and saying, "Have you been sexually assaulted?" I mean, I remember hearing that on the radio. I remember hearing a woman being asked that live on radio and thinking, there's something really treacherous about this terrain. You know, on the one hand, it's so important, and it did feel really kind of amazing and powerful to hear so many stories and to have all kinds of people taking it seriously, perhaps in ways that they hadn't before. But I worried about the modes in which that interest sometimes was articulated in ways that, you know, especially in those early stages, as you described, when it focused around the film industry, was also imbued with a sense of spectacle that was not unrelated to the industry that it was about. So, you know, I was kind of concerned by this, you know, the titillation and the kind of frisson of, you know, when's your story going to come? Are you going to tell your story? Whose story is next? That I think actually collectively, probably a lot of us were also feeling that sense of kind of excitement as well as dread. And I think that, you know, women at that moment were being asked to kind of speak the truth in order to hopefully correct all these past wrongs, you know, so the burden again being placed on women disproportionately to tell these incredibly painful stories, to relive, you know, some of the most humiliating, painful moments of their life in the service of, you know, making the world a better place, which of course perhaps that is a crucial part of it, and it's important that it's done, and it's always, you know, crucial to support women who are doing that. But I felt concerned about the requirement to speak, and I was really struck, Rowena, when you said something about privacy, that there was this whole phase of your life that was about secrecy, this terrible secret, and then this moment of privacy. And I do think about that a lot, that, you know, I think it's so crucial that women feel able to tell their stories and that they're supported when they do. But that privacy is also a really valuable and important thing, perhaps all the more so for someone who's gone through something incredibly painful. So those kind of things were playing on my mind, and those questions in a way formed part of the terrain for my starting to think about the book that became Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again. But another thing in my work that I found so interesting to think about in relation to Complicit was this issue of sort of managing a large male ego, in the form of a film star and a producer who has a lot of money and who knows his own power, and how Sarah, as the protagonist, is sort of having to calibrate her own ambition in relation to these moments, so many moments in the novel of kind of intense momentousness, minute decisions that she has to make, and I think a lot of us are familiar with those moments in our daily lives as well, does one sort of go along or massage the male ego? Does one let something slide in order to make one's life and one's day easier, but also sometimes to get something that one wants and that one has a right to want, to be ambitious, to get that commission, to get that next job or whatever it is. And I thought the novel did that so beautifully. And for me, that issue of the no, whether women are able to say no is sort of the ground on which so much else rests. And I remember hearing one of the victims of Harvey Weinstein in the early days of Me Too talking about being afraid to poke the bear, that you had to be so careful around somebody like him, because a no would sort of make things worse. It would inflame his anger, and anger and sexual violence are very linked. So being very careful not to make a man angry is part of how women are socialized to manage the fear, the very real fear of pervasive sexual violence. But because we are so effectively taught to be very careful about how we say no to men, that also comes back to haunt us, because in a court of law, if you've said a no without quite saying no, but you've been kind of delicately moving around this obstacle in such a way to preserve yourself and not to provoke the man, then the delicacy of your no becomes the ground for the exoneration of the man who's been accused of sexual violence. And for me, that issue that I think you do so beautifully in the book is like, it's one of the foundational problems, because if a no is difficult to say and difficult to read socially, then what is the point of all our emphasis on yes? And in a way, that's the question of my book, is, if no's become emptied out and become meaningless, then part of what I describe in the book as a kind of exhortation on women to be sexually confident, to embrace their desire, to articulate their desire very clearly and emphatically so that misunderstandings don't happen and so that they can avoid sexual violence. What the hell are we doing in placing the burden on women to say a yes and embody this kind of, enthusiastic sexual posture, when yes is just as meaningless as no, when the very kind of foundations of women's speech is so kind of eradicated from them. So, yeah, I found reading Complicit just such a beautifully kind of painstaking portrait of those, minute decisions that women have to make all the time that can have, devastating consequences.
I mean, you teach creative writing actually here at Birkbeck. What do you think is the role of fiction in creating better worlds, more equitable worlds where girls and women don't have to daily ask the questions that you're asking?
I think it's a really important part of the many, many solutions, as Liz was also saying, that, I think there are so many fronts that we have to work on all the time. And, whether that's to do with the police and how policing works, whether that's to do with, the law, getting the law right around sexual consent and myriad other things. But I do think that represent, like, really fine-grained representations of people's experience is really valuable. And I think, we see that. For instance, Michaela Coel's I May Destroy You. Obviously that, that was a screenplay. But I think that kind of a really textured evocation of somebody's life, of them as a person, a full person, not just the kind of trope of the sexual victim in the, in so many films where I feel like I've so often had that experience with films where there's a woman who comes on screen and you're like, oh yeah, I know what's going to happen. She's going to be the victim of sexual violence that gets a plot going, usually between men. In this kind of Sedgwick terms, it's all about relationships between men ultimately, and women are sort of used often in plots in that way. But things that don't do that, that really take seriously women's very complex subjectivity and their mixed feelings, and then show you the ramifications of sexual violence or aggressive male behaviour on them. I think they can be profoundly transformative for women who feel represented, finally perhaps, but also for men who watch it or read it and might think back on some of their own actions. And I think that was something that did happen in the Me Too movement, which obviously has also had very unsteady and kind of scattershot effects, and some of which have been a retrenchment that I think we're probably seeing very much now. But also, more people taking a bit more time to reflect on something that all of us often, I think, have an investment in not thinking about, because it's either just too unsettling or too painful. So I think the creative kind of works in a culture are really important and can be really transformative.
Great, lovely. Thank you very much. But we're actually now going to hear from the author herself reading to us, and this will be followed by a brief Q&A. But Winnie, great. Winnie, do you want to read something from the novel?
First of all, obviously very humbling to hear all these wonderful and incredibly expertise opinions on my book. And I guess interestingly, that the section I'm about to read probably reflects in a lot of ways, or ties to a lot of what's just been said, in terms of power, in terms of trying to creep around male behavior. So this section, so Sarah is in the middle of her second interview with Tom Gallagher, who is the celebrated New York Times journalist who's trying to uncover her story. And at this point, so Hugo North is the big financier, and she has just she's recounting how she witnessed his behavior around other women, around young actresses who were, quite hopeful to get an important role that they were about to cast in this film that was filmed 10 years ago. So Tom's asking this question. Can you recall any other specific encounters between Hugo and female actors hoping to be cast? I strained my memory as if forcing it through a sieve. That was the first time I'd noticed. Undoubtedly, there would have been others. What do you mean by that? Well, put yourself in their position. You're a young, aspiring actress. You audition for a role you desperately want, a plum role that could launch your career. And then you get a phone call from the production asking you to meet the producer. This could be where they tell you you've got the part, or where you convince them of your talent and your passion. Any communication from a producer is a source of hope of, quote unquote, what might happen. Did Hugo ever ask you to get in contact with these actors, female actors? I hesitate. I have been losing sleep these past few weeks trying to separate what I did from what I suspected, even that early on. These are fine gradations, painful reassessments for me. Most probably he did ask me to set up meetings with these actresses, and I complied, just like Ziggy, the other assistant, would have done. Hugo was my boss, after all. It wasn't my role to question him, was it? I just thought, okay, this is how Hugo operates. He has money. He likes to meet attractive young women who want to work in the industry. He's certainly not the first powerful, wealthy man who had to act like that. Well, what do you mean by that statement? I stare at Tom Gallagher and wonder how much easier this interview would be if he were a woman. Well, I mean, it's not just actresses who have to deal with this. In my experience as a young woman in the film industry, it is fairly standard that at some point, some guy you are working with will come onto you. It can be subtle, a middle-aged unit photographer to whom you have zero attraction, suggesting a pretty girl like you ought to have a drink. It can be more overt, an older actor you've worked with for months suggesting you stay in his hotel room that night. And it can be shameless, a white-haired, 60-something male film critic planting a wet kiss on your lips as you leave a party, his hand cradling your buttock. Such behavior was impossible to avoid. The rules seem to be, if you're a young woman in this industry, you're fair game. So how did you personally deal with that? I shrug. You construct a stoic facade to fend off the unwanted attention. I mean, I didn't in any of those 3 instances sleep with the male in question. I came up with some witty but firm response, hoping it was clear enough I was uninterested without having to be rude. Did it get tiring to deal with? Yeah, absolutely. Of course it's irritating. Of course the naive you is thinking that maybe this older male film critic is inviting you to events because he's interested in your thoughts on genre and female directors, when really he just wants to sleep with you. Eventually, you stop being so naive. But the witty response, the ability to demonstrate a resourceful defense, is key. Most importantly, you don't show weakness. Men are programmed to prey on weakness. Is that what you think? Well, not all men, of course, but in film, there's always a power balance. The powerful prey on the weak become disposable, expendable, then vanish. So if you want to survive, you don't show your weakness.
Buy the book, it's fantastic. Okay, we have now about 15 minutes for a Q&A. I'm not sure if Ruth is here. Do you want to come up here? Ruth will be dealing with the chat online. If there are any questions or comments there. While she's coming down, is there anything from people here? Yes. Do you want to stand? I will repeat the questions for the online audience. Thanks very much. That I really appreciate your comments. So just for the people online, the question is relating to the role of law in silencing victims of abuse and what we can do about it. I'm not sure who wants to start. Katherine, I think you've got the other mic there. So we'll just share it between us. I don't know who in the panel wants to go first. Liz, maybe.
I am aware of this happening, and I think it happens in a different way in the family courts, where many women are advised not to speak about their experience of domestic abuse in the family court because it might go against them. And it's also then to do with the relationship with children and the relative safety of women and children, and how we don't have a system that can hold those two things together at the same time. I'm also aware of women who have been accused of libel. Some time ago, there was a very painful case that when I was involved in Justice for Women about 20 years ago, that we were involved in supporting a woman around. And I think it's really difficult because one of the things I realised the other week talking to one of my colleagues is that that phrase that the police often use or that lawyers use, he said, she said. Why is he first in that sentence? And there's something about men's words and a system where their words are going to be heard first and heard as more truthful as women's. And I can see that in these police files that I'm dealing with now. They interview a man and he just has to give, they say, the suspect gave a convincing account. I have never seen them write that about the account of a survivor. And so there's something about my friend Jan Jordan, her first book was called The Words of a Woman, and how women's words are, and children's words actually, are doubted. So there's something big and cultural that we need to change, not just the law, is what I'm saying. That law reflects something bigger for me.
I mean, I was actually just going to say Rowena's probably the perfect person to speak about this because of NDAs and non-disclosure agreements and how the threat of the law is used preemptively to silence. But yeah.
I want to say first, thank you for sharing your story. I know that each time you do that, it's very difficult. It's hard to know even where to begin. Of course, famously, it's widely known that I was silenced by this NDA that was incredibly restrictive and constrictive. There are often many misunderstandings about my NDA. For instance, I'm asked by journalists, well, doesn't it feel good now to be free of your NDA? I'm actually not free of my NDA. It was a legal document that bound those of us that signed it for the rest of our lives. There was no end date. It doesn't matter that Harvey has gone to jail or been known as a convicted rapist. My NDA actually still stands. And so therefore, every time I speak about it publicly on any public forum, on television or in a newspaper or in this very room, I am currently breaking my NDA. And so I'm going against a legal document that I am bound by. But I wanted to speak about something broader than that. We talked about a network of enablers that existed within the film industry and within my personal story. I will say that I also live in daily fear that somebody will bring a libel case against me, because when I speak about my story, it's impossible to separate Harvey's actions from the actions of those that protected him. And those that protected him, including his personal lawyer, whose initials are on every page of my NDA, or other people that were working for Miramax at the time, or that Zelda Perkins and I appealed to and turned us away, are still very much operational and very powerful within Hollywood, and they're some of the most senior people in Hollywood. They certainly have the means and the wherewithal and likely the desire to sue us for libel. I think so far we have sort of been under a weird cloud of protection because at the moment, or rather initially, the Me Too movement was survivor friendly. And there may be, as you say, quite rightly, a backlash at some point. And due to the fact that we are under this, legally bound to the NDA for the rest of our lives, there's no limitation as to when we could be sued. So that, of course, the legal reality is very terrifying, but I think that speaks actually to something broader than just our own case, that the legal system, as I was once told by a female lawyer, is very often written by old white men for the benefit of old white men. So certainly Zelda and Perkins and I, in our various incarnations of attempting to sue Harvey, both in 1998 and then when our story broke in 2017, really were up against the realities of the legal system being very inadequate for women. That sentence can't be stressed enough. In terms of what we can do, many of us, of course, yourself included, are working to actually affect legal change as well as societal and cultural change. But that, of course, is incredibly slow and very difficult.
I think there's a comment or question online. Do you want to?
Yeah, there's a couple of related questions online. So one is from Iman. My question is, through the growing use of defamation to target and scare survivors, what surrounding effect does this have overall, and how can it be countered? So you may feel you've answered that sufficiently. And the other is from Emily J. How can we help workplace leaders create a safe environment for survivors to speak out on such a taboo, despite Me Too topic, and be supported?
I have a piece out in iPaper today actually about that, or about addressing sexual assault and trauma in a workplace context. So, the article suggests that I suggest there should be actually some kind of, in the same way that there's a bereavement leave if you're an employee and a close person passes away in your life, that there would be a similar kind of leave that you could get if you become a victim of sexual assault, because frankly, the trauma is that intense, right? And so it's ridiculous for somebody to experience rape and then to expect them to be performing at the top of their game the next day as an employee. And that demand for them to be at the top of the game and delivering professionally is actually quite damaging for somebody who's just gone through that kind of trauma. So there's that, but then also it's about creating an atmosphere where employees are encouraged to share the truth of what's happened to them. So after my rape, I sent this email out to one of my work contact. We had a film that was about to, was in the process of being distributed, and I had to send this really boring series of emails, and I wasn't up for it. I didn't want to have to list the deliverables like a few days after my rape, so I kind of wrote back to this contact and I was like, listen, I'm really sorry, but over the weekend I was assaulted and raped, so I'm just going to pass this on to my colleague to deal with. And my boss at the time had said, maybe don't be so direct next time in terms of saying what you just went through, and I was kind of like, well, come on. Like, I mean, I was a little bit annoyed by that because, like, if my cat had died, or if my grandmother had died, or if I'd gotten hit by a car, I would have said I've been hit by a car, and they would have said, "Oh, I'm so sorry." But what, like, the truth of what actually happened to me is just too shocking. For me to, there's too much of a stigma about it for me to share, because we all know, I mean, hopefully in this room, I think we all know how prevalent sexual violence is. So why do we have to keep on trying to hide this and pretend that it didn't happen to us, when it obviously is going to affect our capacity to perform work? So, so I think just creating an environment where workers, employees know that they can share the truth, and also where they know that they can be supported. So, you know, my boss actually paid for counseling, which was great. You know, obviously after a while she ran out of money to pay for my counseling. After a while, I no longer had the job. But there was that, you know, and I think if I had a male boss, I maybe wouldn't have felt comfortable even sharing that truth with him, and I would have had a whole completely different experience of recovery and post-rape because I had a male boss who maybe wouldn't have been as sympathetic towards these issues.
So the question is, what do members of the panel think about Catherine's comment that yes is as meaningless as no?
So when I say that, what I mean is that if a woman's no is emptied out from the beginning, so, you know, thinking, for instance, of the kind of the history of racist representations of black women as already always agreeing to sex, or always being ready for sex. You know, there's a long history of that in kind of colonial and Orientalist writings and behaviours and acts. If no is meaningless, then what is a yes? If a woman is already always thought to be saying yes, how can a woman say yes in a way that has any kind of substantial meaning? How can there be a kind of distinction between a yes and a no if a woman is always presumed to be, you know, malleable and pliable to a man's desire? And in the book, what I talk about is the fact that women are in a really difficult bind because, on the one hand, you know, as I said earlier, it's risky to say no to a man, and we often do this kind of delicate manoeuvring. But women are also urged to say yes to sex, to express their own desire very clearly, partly in order to keep themselves safe. And my quarrel in the book is with that kind of what I talk about as a sort of post-feminist, neoliberal atmosphere around feminism and around women and desire and theories of sexual desire as well that I look at in the book, that place an emphasis in the solution to sexual violence on women having a particular kind of attitude to their own sexuality. And I argue that that is counterproductive, partly because it doesn't take into account the realities of all kinds of women's situation, which is that, in fact, when it comes to consensual sex, women may not always be entirely clear if they want to have sex or not, and that also has to be something that is allowable for women without them being blamed. So yeah, that's to set out my stall more clearly.
I mean, I think in terms of the context of the book, so I mean, in the section I just read, obviously I read, like, you know, Sarah's recounting, you know, 3 instances of, you know, a male film critic like kissing her and then like touching her buttock, and then an actor, you know, suggesting she stay in his hotel room, and then another instance I can't quite remember off the top of my head, all of which actually happened to me in real life. So that is kind of me, where I was kind of like channeling my own experience from film and be like, oh yeah, actually I'll take all those 3 and I'll put them in a novel because it's realistic, right? I mean, I think anyone that's worked in the film industry and other industries will find that to be incredibly realistic. So in terms of like no versus yes, as a woman in that kind of industry, as a young woman, you're constantly there's a constant barrage of like male desire. And Catherine's book is really interesting in terms of how she constructs like male desire, sexual desire is constructed in a very different way in, you know, popular conversation and the way that female desire is constructed. So there's a constant barrage of male desire that you have to like just sidestep, right? Like constant come-ons, right? And as a woman, it's almost like if you want to be taken seriously in your job, it just has to be, you have to be just like no, but no in a very witty, you know, respectable way, I suppose. But then if you were to ever say yes, And I kind of hinted at it with one of the interviews here. If you were to ever say yes, then you would just get a reputation. So you would be like the girl that sleeps around in your workplace. So then suddenly, then there's then you get even more of a barrage. So it's almost like even if you were to say yes, that would kind of brand you for life. And I think a lot of women that work in workplaces probably find that instance that you have to be constantly saying no. And then if you do ever trip up and sleep with, should you be attracted to, a male colleague and actually sleep with them? And if he's the kind of guy that speaks up afterwards to his other mates, then suddenly you're going to get this reputation. So it's almost like your own consent or your own sexual desire as a woman is completely constrained within that kind of male-dominated workplace.
Great. We actually have run out of time. I want to bring Marai into this and also every other member of the panel. So there's one final question online, which we can then use to sort of sum up if there's anything else that people on the panel want to say. So do you want to read it out for us?
There are actually 3, so we'll answer the other 2.
Joe, I'm gonna.
So we have 3 questions left online. We don't have time for them all, but we will answer them during the course of the week. But the first question of the evening was when Winnie was speaking at the very beginning. And the question is slightly lighter, perhaps, than some of the others. Do the panel have any favourite films that deal with the matter of gendered violence? So your favourite films that deal with gendered violence.
I mean...
Oh, okay. Sorry, end with the star of the show.
I think one of my favourites is In the Cut, which was made by, oh God, I hope I'm remembering this right, Jane Campion, based on a book by Susanna Moore, a North American novelist. It was made into a film with Meg Ryan and Mark Ruffalo, and at the time it was rather scornfully treated as a kind of trashy erotic thriller. The book and the film are an amazing exploration of what it is like to live with a very keen awareness of violence and sexual violence sort of closing in on you, all around you, and still trying to find your own sexual pleasure, your own desire, and to inevitably take risks, because every time a woman has sex with a man, she is taking a quite significant risk. It's really beautiful. It treads a very, very fine line. It's very sexy. It's very moving. It's quite shocking. It's absolutely brilliant.
I'm trying to remember the name of this film, and I can't. But it's an Ethiopian film, and it's about how someone from the Women's Lawyers Collective defends a young woman who kills the man she's been forcibly married to, and I just found it. It was a representation of feminism and solidarity, and also a representation of women from Africa not as passive victims, as actually acting in their own lives. I will try and remember the name of it.
Thank you.
I think it's called Diffret. Thank you. Researchers, it's called Diffret.
When I was a young girl growing up in the UK, I loved film, but I was unfortunately subject to a dearth of movies that represented myself. And I was a young adult at the time of China's 5th generation movies becoming very popular at film festivals. And so I'm about to say a very old title that seems like a very odd choice for gender violence. But I was a huge fan of Zhang Yimou. And of course, his movie, Raise the Red Lantern, at the time of my life when I watched it, had a huge impact on me. And I know that this sounds unusual to say as a British-born Chinese woman growing up in the 70s and 80s. I related to the women of that household because, of course, that was a story of feudal China. But I will say, as a story about women who had very little power, but made the most of the little power that they had in terms of the politics with each other and their relationship with the only husband that they all shared, I found something in that story very much in terms of my relations with the people that oppressed me as a young girl both in terms of racism and sexism and that particular intersectionality.
I think Marai has now joined us. Apologies for the technical problems there. Did you want to say something, come in here before we turn finally to Winnie?
So I'm really sorry because I so wanted to respond to a couple of the questions and wasn't able to. I just want to invite us to think about those women, those human beings that are in the most precarious spaces of employment. When we try to think about actually what we can do about workplace harassment, when we try to think about, what we do around responses to sexual violence, actually, for so many women working in particular industries, 0-hour contracts, all of those kind of things, in many ways, we look at the Hollywood space and it's like the big space where there's all of this protection. And then you've got those women, those people on the front line who are in really precarious positions, who have no structures of protection either. So I really invite us to be in the complexity when we're thinking about what we can do, actually think about what do we need to shift societally around what a broader social justice framework, which includes economic justice, and also which deals with, and Catherine, thank you for bringing up colonization, that deals with actually how particular communities, how women from particular contexts are subjugated in particular ways. Me Too did very little in terms of, say, for example, disabled women. Disabled women have been largely erased from the conversations about sexual harassment and so forth. So I just want to invite us to take always a much more intersectional approach and think about who, even in our conversations about sexual violence and harm and resistance, who doesn't have entry into the space, who gets left behind. One of the things that Winnie did beautifully with this is actually really pull out the specificity around Sarah as a Chinese American woman and actually what those experiences are. And we need more of that kind of narrative and more of that nuance, that picks up what does it mean for this particular human being in this moment in time. So that's my little rant. I'm really sorry to have kind of missed whole sections of the conversation just now.
Thanks so much. Thanks. Winnie.
So yeah, I guess we were talking about film and TV. Catherine had mentioned I May Destroy You, which I thought was amazing. The final episode, absolutely beautiful in terms of how a survivor can use her own experience and decide to author it in her own way. And then there's two more. While we were discussing the precarity of work and employment situations and also colonialism, there's a really beautiful, I think, Tunisian film called The Silences of the Palace by a female director, which is, I saw at the Edinburgh Film Festival years ago, and and I've never actually seen it since, but it stayed with me because it's such a beautiful film. And it is about a woman and her daughter who were servants, domestic workers, maids in a wealthier family's household in colonial Tunisia, and it is just about their day-to-day and the relationship between mother and daughter, but then also that constant threat of sexual violence or quote-unquote seduction, or however you want to call it, sexual coercion at the hands of their male employers. But it is also a really beautiful piece of cinema. And then there's a Netflix, on the completely opposite end of the spectrum, there's a Netflix series called Unbelievable, which is like an 8-part kind of like crime thriller, crime drama. And it's got two female detectives, but it starts with the experience of a young woman who is she's just come out of foster care, so she's in a quite vulnerable place in society, and she's not believed, and she's treated awfully at the hands of the police, and then nothing happens with her case. And then years later, two female detectives pick up this trail of rapes that have been taking place, quite similar to hers, and so finally those two narrative strands come together towards the end. But I think, in addition to having two female, quite interesting female detectives, it also just shows the absolute lack of compassion on the part of the police, and oftentimes how dots are not connected, and as a result of dots not being connected, perpetrators are allowed to continue, affecting the lives of other young women and girls.
Great, we're out of time, which I'm really, really sad about. In a few minutes, I want a round of applause for just such an incredible panel here. So thanks very much. But before that, a number of things just to say that people who are here, on your table there is a feedback form. We'd really appreciate feedback, and you can put the form in. There's a couple of boxes in the other room back there. Please do the survey. Please join Shame's mailing list. We'd really love to hear from you. If you join our mailing list, you'll get information about other events that are taking place. I want to also thank Ruth here for doing the online questions. Rianne has been behind the scenes, live tweeting. Huge thanks must go to Ria Sukdeosing, who's our public engagement coordinator, who's responsible for everything that goes really well in the Shame Project, and also, of course, to Alison, who was the main person who organized everything here. So we're really, really grateful for the incredible amount of behind-the-scenes work that goes into events like this taking place. I also, of course, want to thank everyone who's here, either in person or, of course, online. Those of you here in person, there's going to be a book signing, including books from other members of the panel as well. So please buy some books, get them signed. If you're joining us online, the bookseller will also sell you books. So if you write in...
There's an email address, right? So if people can directly email...
Yep.
So is it
It's
info?
been announced
Oh,
a
it
couple
has.
of times in the evening.
Yep.
Yeah, so we can put it on our website
Yes.
and Twitter as well.
Yeah. But finally, I want to thank everyone who's come here, but particularly, of course, the people on the panel who've been just so enlightening and eloquent. Thanks very much.